joining us. I'm Hudson Joyner. I'm our Chief of Staff here at Gnosis Freight, and I'm joined by Parker Quarles. He's one of our product owners for the Gnosis Carbon Emissions products. At Gnosis, we help enterprise shippers and logistics service provider manage the full life cycle of their containers and shipments, and empowering them with operational grade data and execution workflows to help solve their most complex supply chain problems. And today, we're going to be focused on a question that is quickly moving from a sustainability topic to an enterprise reporting requirement. And that's effectively, can your organization explain and defend its freight emissions number? So today, when I refer to scope 3, I mean the indirect emissions across a company's value chain. And within scope 3, category 4 is that upstream transportation and distribution component. So essentially the freight used to move purchased goods into the business. And that's going to be our main focus for today. So I'm going to cover the deadlines, what they require from your teams, and 3 ways that Gnosis approaches the problem differently. And then Parker over here, he's going to show the carbon emissions product in the Gnosis platform using a real live shipment. And then we're going to follow it up by some Q&A. So let's get started. So I'm going to start with the California Senate Bill 253. It's commonly called SB 253, and it generally applies to companies with more than $1 billion in revenue that do business in California, which includes many of the large global shippers that we work with directly and across the industry. The California Air Resources Board, or CARB for short, established November 10th of this year as the first year reporting deadline for scope 1 and scope 2, and that was extended from the original August 10th deadline. Scope 1 covers the emissions from sources a company owns or controls. Scope 2 covers emissions associated with purchased electricity and other energy. And Scope 3 reporting begins next year. And that's where category 4, what we'll talk through today, enters the picture. So the practical point is that the shipments supporting that 2027 disclosure, they're moving right now. And the route, the distance, the weight, the mode, transfers, and all the exceptions behind those movements are much harder to reconstruct after the year is over. So as we kind of move down, Europe is also moving in that same direction. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short, they entered their definitive phase on January 1st of this year. So for covered imports, their first annual declaration is due September 30th next year, covering this year's activity. And so CBAM itself is not a category 4 freight rule, but it does reflect the broader shift toward traceable carbon data across global trade. So there's a lot of shared underlying data points and requirements that CAT 4 also provides. Additionally, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD for short, also requires in-scope companies to report that information. And that includes all the material value chain impacts. Its scope, its timing continue to evolve, but the direction is clear pretty much across the board, and that large enterprises are being asked for consistent, traceable, and assurance-ready information. And that assurance in this context means an independent review of whether the reported carbon emissions, that information is reliable, and we're going to be touching on that a lot today. Regulation is only one source of that pressure. Customer questionnaires, board commitments, investor requests, external consultants, and the CDP, or the Carbon Disclosure Project, they may be bringing those requests to your team before a legal filing date does. So if you haven't already received a notice from your internal teams, you can absolutely reach out proactively. So what does that require from your organization? It effectively requires an owner across sustainability and supply chain, a clear inventory of the operational data that you have, an accepted calculation methodology such as GLEC, documented assumptions and fallbacks, and an audit trail connecting the reported total to the shipments that produced it. So as I mentioned earlier, if your company appears to be in scope and your ESG or sustainability team has not contacted you yet, reach out in advance. That sustainability team is going to be owning the disclosure, but the freight activity lives with you in the supply chain. Doing that legwork now is going to be able to save you time, a lot of rework, and stress when that request becomes urgent. So as we get into Q&A later, glad to answer any questions regarding any of the incoming deadlines and regulations. Fast forwarding here, we wanted to touch on our approach and highlight 3 core differences and how we approach carbon emissions within our platform. And we have effectively designed to account for these differences and how large enterprises, specifically multinational enterprises, work with all these different type of regulations. The first core difference is that we begin with the operating record, not a year-end file. So Gnosis Carbon Emission runs within our CLM platform, our container lifecycle management platform, and that same record that tracks the container supports the emissions calculation. So what that allows us to use is the movement that actually occurred. So for the ocean leg, we can derive route and distance from vessel tracking data rather than assuming the most common path between 2 ports. We can also use available container weight and execution data for rail and short haul trucking. A spreadsheet may assume that a canal transit, for example, while the vessel actually rerouted around a disruption. So that number should reflect the difference. The second difference is a disciplined exception management approach. So in freight, the best possible data point isn't always when the business needs the answer. A strong system has to know what that is, what it does not have, and ultimately which approved fallback comes next. And a lot of the frameworks suggest guidances around that. So a great example of that is vessel fuel burn. So at the highest level of precision, actual fuel consumption by fuel type can support a vessel level fuel burn calculation. But the reality in practice is that that information is often commercially sensitive. It's aggregated at the ship level, it's reconciled annually, and it's not widely available real time or at the container level. So carriers right now are piloting ways to deliver that at scale, but the access is not consistent. So our response is to not stop the calculation and is to not present an estimate that isn't an actual. Instead, what we're going to do is use the best available source and then move through that controlled fallback hierarchy. So when an actual consumption data is unavailable, we can rely on the documented assumptions provided by the GLEC framework, for example, and so that source and the fallback remain visible so that you can distinguish measured data from modeled data. The third difference is one traceable record that is ready for all of your internal reporting. Ocean, rail, drayage, and all of those handling points can be resolved within the same container journey. Drayage is the short haul truck movement between the port, rail ramp, and warehouse or nearby facility, and the user can review that result by shipment, transportation leg, and handling point. And you can see all the methodology and assumptions within that same container record. So what we're not trying to do is replace your enterprise's sustainability advisor. Your consultants and your auditors can continue to own that broader greenhouse gas inventory, all the reporting boundaries and those disclosures. What we're going to do is strengthen that freight line by providing all of the category 4 data and documented methodology instead of disconnected spreadsheets. So for a large global shipper, the outcome is strong control over a material disclosure, less manual reconciliation across business units and carriers, and a clear path from the corporate total that needs to be reported back to the underlying movement. So over time, that same data can support lane comparisons, carrier scorecards, allocation decisions, and even reduction targets. So as Parker walks through the demo here in a bit, I'd ask for you guys to look at a couple things. One, whether the calculation reflects the movement that occurred, whether exceptions and fallbacks are transparent, and whether that output can move directly into the sustainability team's process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Parker to show a live demo within the Gnosis platform.
Awesome. Thank you, Hudson. That was fantastic. So I'm sure you guys are eager to see the product in action itself. And the first thing I'm going to do is jump into the Gnosis platform. The first call out I have is that this carbon emissions product is going to have its own dedicated set of pages here on our sidebar or our navigation pane on this left side. As I click into this, you'll notice we have 3 separate pages. We have a dashboard meant to host like high-level statistics or KPIs. We have a details page that hosts the core of our calculations. And then we have a carbon network map that kind of helps you see everything at a bird's eye view. The first place I'm going to drill into is our dashboard page. So as I click in here, you'll see that this page is comprised of what we call widgets or cards in our platform. And each of these cards has its own specific focus and it's backed by our underlying data. So at a glance, we can show people what their year-to-date emissions look like. what last year's emissions look like, what your like per container. We can even get further into the data and show what your tonnage is by ocean carrier, how your emissions may be trending month to month. And lastly, we also have another kind of pivot table here that highlights what your emissions look like per lane. This is exclusively helpful for like seeing where your container volume is concentrated and what those average emissions are at those given lanes. Now, one thing to call out is that all of these cards are configurable by our account management team. So provided that we have the underlying data, we can configure or tailor these cards specific to what your sustainability team wants to see. Now, all of these we've pre-populated. These are kind of our tried and true standard cards that we surface. And there's one in particular that I do want to call out on this page. It is this one here that says sources and assumptions. So instead of hiding all of our calculations behind our infrastructure or anything like that, we actually give you a place to click. And upon clicking this card, you can be brought to a direct file that hosts all of our sources and assumptions that we've made and what backs our Gnosis data model for these carbon emissions. In practice, this makes everyone's lives simpler. So as you take an export of emissions out of our platform, you can couple that directly with these assumptions. And it's very clear our entire methodology is right there in that Word document. As I move on, I'm going to go into this details page. This, like I mentioned before, is really the core of where all of our data is hosted. So you'll note that this first table here is showing all of your carbon emissions at a container level. So we do aggregate it up at this container level. You'll see here we have the total emissions, the total distance for that container, and then we will further disaggregate that down into those separate transport chain elements like a vessel move, a rail move, and then even at those kind of hub nodes that we're calling like the port of load, the port of discharge, any rail terminals that Hudson mentioned earlier. So the first thing that I do want to show in specific to what Hudson was alluding to with the actual vessel distance is where we can show that to you. So here in this platform, we have this eye icon on the left. We call this our container details pop-up in our platform. And this just hosts summary data about that container shipment itself. But in particular, I want to highlight over here in the right, this map on this right side will actually host the vessel's AIS data. So this red line you're seeing coming from Denmark into Norfolk is the true geopings from satellite data indicating the exact route that vessel moved. So instead of doing these lane averages or relying on low code to low code, distance with an adjustment factor, we'll go ahead and have that measured distance in kilometers and be able to use that in the calculation. And this adds up over time, right? So if you have thousands of containers and you're using averages, you might end up being grossly understating or overstating what your true emissions picture looks like. As I exit out of this, there's a couple more things I want to call attention to on this page. The first is what Hudson said about, we have one pipeline that hosts the full journey. And so on this particular shipment, you'll see over here, we have different columns that map out the emissions attributed to what we'll call legs or transport moves, and then the emissions attributed to what we'll call nodes or your kind of transport hubs. We have the emissions called out here, but you can also drill into those further to see exactly the route that this container took and what emissions are made up at each stage. So as I click in here, you'll notice we have 3 different legs that this container traveled on. We have an ocean leg, a rail leg, and a drayage leg. And for each of these legs, we have the specific distance that each traveled, as well as the origin and the destination of those transport moves, right? And then you can also get into that breakdown of the specific emissions attributed to each one of these legs. The nodes look really similar to this. You can drill in and view the handling emissions associated with each of these node types. And then the other thing I will call out is if you are wanting to have a separate export of that information or anything that's not in this drill through capability, we have supporting tables below where you can specifically look at your emissions by transport move versus transport hubs or nodes. One additional thing on this page that is sort of a unique thing that we do here at Gnosis is we like to try and project your carbon emissions. So instead of waiting for the journey to be fully completed and then kind of doing a post-mortem and going back and trying to calculate at each stage, we can actually, because we have this operational grade data, we can proactively project and construct these emission chains. So over here, I'm going to show this is projection column. And what I'm going to do is refine this just down to anything that we're currently projecting. Let me find, oh, sorry, back a page. Let me get back to that. And so what I'm going to show here is that for any one of these containers, let's maybe pick one, for example. This container is actually still at origin, right? So this is still over, getting ready to load over in Geneva. It has not yet started its journey, but because here, I can show this in our container details section, we know the data around how this container is going to move, right? It's going to be received in Geneva. It's going to discharge in New York. It looks like it's also going to rail inland to Chicago. Since we can see this and we can build it out proactively and then reference our historical data for these lanes, we can get an idea of what we project those emissions to be. So up here, we'll call it out with a projected amount. And then as this container moves along in its journey and we start to get these actuals from the vessel AIS data, the rail moves, et cetera, we will always come in and overwrite that estimate with actuals. So this grid will always show you the most up-to-date emissions information. While we will update this grid, we will still retain those projections in our back end. So this is kind of twofold benefit. We're able to then surface to you how well our projections were against those actuals. And then it also helps our engineering team further refine how those projections are being calculated. One of the last things I'll show on this page, and probably the simplest and yet most effective things on this page, is how to get this prepared for your auditing team or your internal consultants or anyone who's helping you prepare this carbon emissions package. All you have to do is, I think, 3 clicks. You come up here to the right where you see these 3 dots. You have an export button and you can directly export to Excel from there. It doesn't get any simpler than that. You can come in, export directly to Excel, couple that with our sources and assumptions, and provide that directly to your auditors. The other thing I'd like to quickly go over is just this carbon network map. So this is really intended to help you see where your freight emissions are sort of getting concentrated. We will actually store all of your containers, lanes, and moves within this interactive visual. It can look like a lot at first, but that is because it does have everything. It's got your ocean moves, it's got your rail moves, drayage, geocoded kind of routes in here as well. Call out by volume, so you can use this slider at the top to refine down and see where is the concentration of your container moves and what lanes are they. At the bottom, we just give you some summary statistics about your top emitting legs, how much tonnage is being emitted on those legs, as well as your emissions by different transport modes. Lastly, clicking into any of these routes will also render what emissions is specific to that route. So I can see there's 605 tons here. You have 200 containers on this leg, and we can even drill into those specific containers and those moves here directly. So a lot of unique things we're doing over here at Gnosis with this tool. Maybe I'll close with just a quick customer anecdote. We did have one of our clients engage with us and see what we can do for them to get this emissions calculated and packaged quickly. They do use a consultant group to help package up all of those emissions. We said, it's no issue. We want to just try and help make everyone's lives easier. So we got their emissions calculated. We went ahead and provided that with our sources and assumptions. And the consultants came back and said that looked fantastic, right? It helped save time on their end, so they didn't need to validate that all of our emissions were conformant with GLEC standards. And then it helped them reallocate their own time towards some of the more complex emissions calculations that they needed to focus on, such as scope 1 or scope 2. That's all I had planned to share today. I guess I'll hand it back to Hudson, who might have any closing remarks, and then we can do Q&A at the end. Thanks.
Awesome demo. Thanks, Parker. Really appreciate it. So before we move into the questions, I wanted to highlight 3 key takeaways from the session today. 1, the reporting deadlines are approaching, and the data needed for all the future Scope 3 and Category 4 disclosures, they're being created by the shipments moving today. Second, the defensibility does not require pretending every input is perfect. It requires traceable data, transparent assumptions, and all the controlled fallbacks when the preferred data is unavailable. We touched on that earlier. Third, Gnosis brings that process into the same container record used to manage the shipment, so the sustainability team, the consultant, or the auditor can understand how that number was built out. So our goal is simple, turning the freight emissions from a year-end spreadsheet exercise into a number your organization can explain, use, and defend. Really appreciate everyone joining us today, and Parker and I are now ready to take any questions. And we also had a couple submitted in before the webinar, so glad to go over those as well. We'll kind of open it up for about 10-15 seconds here to see if there's any. Okay, we'll go ahead and touch on some of the ones we received beforehand. Parker, I think this one is going to be right in your bucket. What happens if for some reason you don't have vessel AIS data for a shipment?
Good question. So, I mean, we're more often than not, we're going to have that information. But to your point, if there is any circumstance where we don't, we will look back through all of our records for that same lane historically. We'll take all of the computed measured distance, grab the median distance, and use that to apply to our projections. If we don't have that lane in our database for any reason, then we default back to a low code to low code distance while including a distance adjustment factor, and that's all compliant with GLEC standard methodologies.
Awesome, thank you. And we received this next question a good bit, all around reporting. The question kind of synthesized was, is there any automated reporting within the tooling? I know we covered that a little bit. Or can we work with the team to build something around our own internal sustainability and ESG requirements? Parker, you want to take that one?
Absolutely. So there's standard reporting out of the box. We have a report builder functionality in our system as part of its base offerings. But we know that not every company's ESG reporting might look the same. So our team can definitely work with yours to build out any custom reports needed so that your auditors get exactly the format and the level of detail that they need. If for any reason that Excel export is not sufficient, we can work with teams to get them what they need.
Awesome. Thanks, Parker. Another one that we have was surrounding how to actually obtain this particular solution. And it was, what are the minimum requirements to obtain the Gnosis Carbon Emissions? Can we access it via API? So a couple ways to answer this. One, the primary requirement for a lot of what Parker showed today is our base CLM offering. So in other words, as long as you're tracking containers through our base platform API, we can expose those type of external endpoints for you to pull the emissions data directly with really no separate integration needed. So core platform, and if you need those interfaced via API for any other reporting or internal systems, we can definitely take care of that. And then for drayage emissions specifically, we also need the delivery location for each container. So for some of our customers that are leveraging this tool today, that's typically captured through our drayage management product. And a full drayage management implementation isn't necessarily required for this type of tooling. You can simply provide us the applicable delivery locations for each container. So a couple different parameters there, but for the most part, our core platform services, whether through our software or our API, enables all this. And this is something that we can turn on for your organization very, very quickly as well. Awesome. Well, I think that pretty much polishes up all of the questions we received, and just wanted to say thank you for everyone for joining today. Parker and myself and the Gnosis team are here to answer any other follow-up questions, and Whether you're currently engaged with us or you haven't yet, we welcome you to reach out and glad to support. Really appreciate everyone's time today.